Hi everyone, Number One Marmaduke fan here. I am rereading the Stan Lee Steve Ditko run on the very first volume of The Amazing Spider-Man. This is in preparation for a video where I want to talk about the pacing of these old Spider-Man stories and do kind of a compare-contrast with contemporary stories. I don't know what I'm going to discover yet. That's because I don't want to state what my conclusions are before I finish reading them. But what I suspect is we're going to see a lot more of dense packing of stuff into Spider-Man's life in this 1960s era of comic. I think this was published in 1963. Than in the contemporary era where, for example, Spider-Gwen, there's been a story that's stretched over about, I think, 8 or 10 issues is what I read of Spider-Gwen, all of her kind of butting heads with an alternate version of the Kingpin. Spider-Gwen lives in another universe. So what the point I'm hoping to make is that when building new characters, you need to have a lot of interesting stuff happen to them, and a lot of interesting stuff should happen every issue. And I see some great things in new characters like Spider-Gwen, more so Moon Girl, Gwenpool, but a lot of these issues, Gwenpool's canceled, Moon Girl is not selling very well. Go signal boost that, guys. Move the needle, Moon Girl. But as I've been reading Spider-Man to make a video kind of talking about old Spider-Man comics and newer Marvel comics, I've been rereading I think this is actually my first time reading the letters column carefully. Now, do not pirate comics. I legally own digital scans of these purchased through the CD collection published by Topics Entertainment, which is fantastic. It's 11 CDs, about 500 issues of just The Amazing Spider-Man, not like alternate versions of the character they did, like Web of Spider-Man or Peter Parker Spider-Man. It's just Amazing Spider-Man, and you get everything. You get all the old time capsule ads, you get all the letters columns. I really wish this kind of stuff would be, at least the letters columns, I wish Marvel would retain that and republish that in maybe trade paperbacks or hardcover editions when they re-release these stories. Maybe that's just not practical for them. But the benefit of reading a letters column in an old comic, if you do not do this already, is you are getting a window into the character's history and how people were reacting to the characters. And sometimes the letters are just charmingly written. They're very 1960s-esque. Sometimes little children are clearly writing in, and I dig that aspect of it. I won't be reading all of these, of course, because a lot of them will have the overlap of saying, oh boy, he's a great character. I love the story. I love the art. But as this is the very first letters column, Spider's Web, published in Amazing Spider-Man number 3, they couldn't do a letters column for number 1 or 2, of course, because they had to receive the letters before they could publish them. I think this would be worth looking at, and I may do a series called Gems from the Letters column, where if I find something really, really good in a letters column, I will make a video about that. And this will probably be the only one where I do a whole Spider's Web because it's the first one, and that makes it seem a little special somehow. So, and I won't read every word. I'm just going to give you the highlights a bit. So the first letter was written by Tom, our boy Tom. And the first thing I would note is that he identifies immediately what is impactful about the character of Spider-Man. I'm not going to read everything, so let's start here. In the Spider-Man, you have a hero that really reaches out to the hearts of the readers. His financial state, his social life, and his acceptance as a superhero are all things that make this guy appealing. Yes, appealing. His appeal is gained more through pity than admiration of him. And oh, how I hate that J. Jonah Jameson. I can't really say that I know a fictional character that I've hated so much. Of course, being as I hate him, I have to put in a good word for him. Like, how can the reading public believe what this guy writes? I can understand how a few or even a majority might have sided with him after his first editorial, and it's understandable that as each new masterpiece on his part came off the press, that his following might increase. But when Spider-Man saves this bum's son and then he turns around and claims that the Spider-Man is a headline grabber, come on! And he's got ellipses and an exclamation point, like, ah! I say that this J. Jameson guy is the headline grabber. I love this. This is so enthusiastic, and it's a very sincere expression of his emotional reaction to the story. So this is great. Tom has just immediately identified in the very first issue of Spider-Man what he likes about the character. And then these letter columns are also a great way of seeing how the editors and wrote back to the fans in kind of this chipper but respectful tone. So they kind of corrected him about why Spider-Man has spider strength. Jerome, he just sort of kind of praised the character, asked if he could be published more regularly. Fred, this is interesting. Fred thinks that Spider-Man's reputation, his good name, should be restored, and that he should become more of a normal superhero. And then maybe Stan Lee jokes back, "So are we, Fred, but tell us, just what is a normal superhero?" What's interesting about Fred Bronson and other of these letters is that they're getting at something interesting, which is Spider-Man a character who is loved because he's behind the 8 ball so much, or is he a character who kind of turns people away because he's behind the 8 ball too much? So how much does it take before a character having bad things happen to them becomes a little bit ridiculous? And if you haven't, I would look up cartoonist Peter Baggs' sort of tongue-in-cheek article, "Why I Hate Spider-Man." I think that's its title. And I see it as kind of a good-natured roast of Spider-Man, where he's arguing that Spider-Man's a total sad sack and kind of a simp. And that's an interesting thing to think about, because one of the reasons a lot of people like Spider-Man is so much bad stuff happens for him, and you're rooting for him to have his life turn out okay. But sometimes it gets to the point where you just feel like he's a little bit of a sad sack. Can't anything good ever happen to this poor simp? And some of these letters are getting at that. Like, they want Spider-Man to succeed. They want Spider-Man to have justice. So there's maybe a fine balance where a lot of bad things happen to Spider-Man in these early issues. And if it's too much, it may be a little ridiculous, but by teasing the readers a little bit and not letting Spider-Man have a happy ending right away, that kept people invested for a long time. Bill, what did Bill write about? He just wrote in with a few suggestions. Oh, I noticed that there was some debates about how Jack Kirby drew them. Who was it? I think that, okay, so Tom is the very first letter. Tom really liked how Steve Ditko drew the Fantastic Four. And then I think Fred here did not like Steve Ditko. I don't think Steve Ditko drew the FF too well. In some panels, the Human Torch looked like he did in Fantastic Four #1 and #2. If Spider-Man is treated right and is made to appear to the public as a normal superhero, he will be one of the better ones. Yeah, so there's debate already about Steve Ditko's kind of rough, simple cartoon style. What did Bill write about? He requested to keep having Steve Ditko do it. Made a few suggestions about having previews and such. What's the next good one? Okay, here's the one I think must have been written by a little kid. "Dear Spider-Man, I feel sorry for you, buddy. It was pretty mean of the Fantastic Four to desert you, but I think they will let you in if you tell them about your problems and beat the rocks out of Thing's head. I'm sure Johnny Storm is on your side. I'm going to write to the Fantastic Four as soon as possible. Your full of pity friend, Frank." And then the editorial comment kind of jokes, "Hey, the Fantastic Four get enough letters. We need the letters." Phil praises the title logo. He jokes about how he missed Amazing Fantasy #15, the debut origin story of Spider-Man, and you can give me 50 lashes with the wet noodle for this. He praises his costume, and he says, "Here's to Spider-Man's running 50 years in his own comic." Only 50, they ask. It's so nice looking back at this, and he did reach 50 years. He's over 50 years old, Spider-Man, by now. "Dear Stan and Steve," who wrote this one? Buddy. Okay, there was something really interesting in Buddy's letter that I had never noticed or thought about before, even though I've read and reread Ditko's run on Spider-Man. So let's see here. He praises the character. He thinks that Spider-Man is going to be a natural success. The reaction of the reader. Let's just read this. A superhero's success is based on the reaction of the reader to said superhero's assortment of superpowers, the quality of his art, and lastly, the writing quality. I'm sure you know this better than I. I think reader reaction to Spider-Man's powers will be almost wholly in his favor. His powers are original, different, and very interesting, to say the least. You've no problem on this point. As to the art, I have nothing but praise. Mr. Ditko is the perfect choice to illustrate Spider-Man. He's had much experience illustrating weird and offbeat stories, as in the case of Amazing Fantasy. When he began to draw Spider-Man, he also proved he could handle a superhero as well. But of interest is the fact that he could inject into the Spider-Man art the weird feeling from his earlier work of unusual stories. Mr. Ditko has a knack for drawing a man that so that he seems half man and half spider, the Spider-Man. His style in the SM art is almost hypnotic. He draws SM in such poses as to suggest a spider, and he does it so well that I find myself counting Spider-Man's limbs to assure myself that he has no more than 4. And then he kind of roasts, I think he roasts the writing a little bit. And then the editorial comment is, thanks, we think. So, this was really thoughtful, and this had never occurred to me before reading Steve Ditko's work. One of the things I used to admire about Erik Larsen when I was a little kid was I would hear interviews talking about him, with him talking about how he wanted Spider-Man to have a spider-like quality to his posing, so he would distort the body or, do what he'd need to, compress the body, twist it around, depart from realism to make Spider-Man appear more spider-like and eerie. And that was one of the reasons I admired Erik Larsen so much as a little child, reading those books. And here is Buddy noticing a similar tendency in Steve Ditko's art years before, which I always attributed that to just awkwardness in Steve Ditko's drawing style, of him maybe just having a little bit of wonkiness in how he drew the human form. Buddy is hypothesizing that is deliberate, and a way of making Spider-Man appear more spider-like. So that's a really fascinating thesis, because you will see sometimes these poses in the Steve Ditko comics of, Spider-Man's kind of bent over a little weird, or his arms are kind of bending funny. So is that Steve Ditko drawing quickly and drawing a little loosely and departing from reality just by accident, or is that Steve Ditko deliberately playing up the creepiness factor of a character like Spider-Man? Who wrote this one? Doug, not our boy Doug, but a different Doug, suggested that Spider-Man should have a partner in crime, as it were, to help him keep his secret identity safe. Okay, in this one, Margaret Seth, so a real gamer girl, writing into the very first edition of the Spider's Web. This just cracked me up a little bit. Having read almost as many stories as you have written, I feel my opinion is as good as the next fellow's, meaning to say that your startling story in #1 copy of Spider-Man was terrific. And to that, I think she is referring to the story where he fights the Fantastic Four and then the Chameleon tries to frame him. But may I ask, what in the world did you do to the second part? Is he so different that nothing can go his way? Your next issue is supposed to be great, but if more of your fans, such as I, feel this way after reading the first issue, well, I don't think I'd waste my good money on another copy like the first. Having read as many of your great stories as I have, I'd just like to know which side of the bed you got up on to finish a good story such as Spider-Man the way you did. Good luck on your next issue. I have a feeling you'll need it. And then they write back, "'Twas an interesting letter, Maggie, although we still can't decide whether you're for us or against us." So responding to a salty letter that essentially says, "I didn't like your comic book," they just say, "Well, that's interesting. Are you for us or against?" That's great. So this is interesting. Maggie is also illustrating the tendency. I'm not 100% sure which part of the story she's referring to. She's referring to #1 of The Amazing Spider-Man. There were 2 stories in that. First was the story where Spider-Man rescued J. Jonah Jameson's son by bringing the spacecraft back to Earth, and then J. Jonah Jameson turned around and blamed Spider-Man for sabotaging the spacecraft. And then the second story is the one where he confronts the Fantastic Four. He kind of foolishly thinks he can get a job with the Fantastic Four, and then picks a fight with them essentially, and then stops a commie plot because Spider-Man hates commies. So I am not 100% sure which of those stories Margaret Seth is referring to, but I think what I can tell she's saying is she doesn't like how nothing works out for Spider-Man. Can't he have a break and win for once? So a fascinating little glimpse into the mind of the original Spider fans way back in 1963. I will not be doing this for every single issue. Again, I would encourage you to legally purchase the CD collection of this on Amazon if you would like to read more of these. You can buy the Spider-Man stories digitally and in paperback format. Of course, they've been re-released multiple times, but they do not include these kinds of features in those re-releases. So for a lot of you, if you can't get that CD collection and get that to work, it's kind of an older edition of Adobe Reader you got to use. Then maybe this series would be a fun way for me to find some really great gems. And I'm going to have a high standard. I want it to be a really good observation on Spider-Man, like Buddy Saunders' observation on the Steve Ditko art. I think that's the kind of thing that would qualify for being worthy of note in a future series of gems from the Spider's web. Anyway, I'm #1 Marmaduke fan. I love you guys. Catch you later. Can we do the diversity in comics thing in this format? Let's try it. I fail!